Yes, sir.
I want to say a couple things.
Please do.
Welcome back. It's been a long time since we've met here at Mound City, and I'm really glad that we're back here. It does come with some baggage being here, like, we've got rules about the, changing of money and all that sorts of thing. But I think you folks are, our main audience, or, certainly one of our most ardent supporters, so I think it's important for us here in the park to support this group being here, and so I've been a champion trying to make sure that this can happen. So I'm really glad to see everybody here. I hope this continues. The only real cap is going to be if we get too many people. We were getting, at one point, we were overflowing before COVID. So until that happens again, though, I'm really glad to have everybody here, and welcome back to Mound City. It's good to see you all.
Thanks for having us, and for bending over backwards to make sure we could get in here. So without much further ado, I'm going to have Alex Armstrong step up, and there's no way I can do him justice. We've met a couple times at a bus trolley tour of the Mounds, and after a lecture or two, I know his face, but I really don't know enough about him, and I've asked him, since he's now going to be a member of our group, to also tell us a little bit about his background, what his influences are that's got him interested in the topic he's going to be speaking about, his plans at Ohio University. And so with that being said, Alex Armstrong, give him a hand.
Well, thanks for that, Gary. Give you all a little introduction. I was born and raised in Athens County. I went to high school in the Plains, and if you've ever been up there, you might have seen, that was a major Adena complex. There still are a lot of mounds in the Plains, and we'd go sit on the top of the mound before a football game. And what's that, sir?
I'm a tick-rich nut.
Oh, good. We go sit up on top of the mounds and drink pop and eat pizza before football games. So that is how I became aware of the ancient heritage that we have in Ohio. And my interest from that time until this time has been amateur interest, just, hobby interest. In the fall, I'll be starting a master's program at Ohio University in the geography department. And everything you're going to see today is not archaeology. So if that bugs you, you can head on home. What I'm studying is how we have seen, viewed, treated, used our mounds and the other earthworks in the period since colonization of Ohio and surrounding area. Hence the title, the historic period. How these earthworks were preserved, how they were not preserved, and kind of everything that has gone on in the middle of that. And the place I want to start with this is not in Ohio. It is way down in Alabama. Don't quote me on that. It's Alabama or Mississippi. Hernando de Soto is the first European who is recorded writing anything about the earthworks of North America and their builders. He came to a town, a native town, of people who were actively using these earthworks. They were their earthworks, they had palaces on them, temples on them, and you have an interesting exchange. De Soto, he's a conqueror, but he's also in kind of a vulnerable position. He's been lost in the wilds for a long time, and he is talking to the local chieftain in this town. The natives have not had rain for a very long time, and De Soto tries to establish himself in a position of prestige by doing a ceremony and having a cross raised on top of their main temple mound. And by miracle or good luck, rain does come, and that's the first interaction we know of a European and what we now call Indian mounds. Believe it or not, that mound still exists. The Archaeological Conservancy owns that property now, and they found the post. That cross, the base of it is still down there. They did dig and found it. That's where we start. That's almost 500 years ago. That's how long Europeans have been aware of and been thinking about these earthworks. Moving back into the Ohio country, though, the earliest The earliest instances of description of these, Marietta is one of the very early ones. We had Dr. Snyder in here from Campus Martius last month and gave a really good presentation about the early views of the Marietta earthworks. The earliest one to have been described at all was actually Circleville. This drawing you see up here was 1775. It's the first published illustration of any type of the earthworks of the Ohio Valley. It appeared in a magazine in Boston, and it's very basic, just shows that classic Hopewellian, square and circle. And Circleville is an interesting case, as most of you probably know of. They platted the town around that circle originally, and that is what the town plat looks like. Do take note of this mound right up here outside the circle. That's going to come up a little later on. Most of Ohio's major cities are built on the same sites as these earthworks. And in part that is because they just happen to occupy nice flat bottomland spots, good for building a city. In many cases, the earthworks were totally obliterated. There's nothing you can go see in Cincinnati or in Cleveland that mentions that there were once mounds there. But there were, and there's not even so much as a historic marker today. Other places, at least remember what used to be there. The village of Bremen has this on their website, and it, is at least some kind of a little remembrance of what this landscape used to be like. Portsmouth, of course, there's a very little bit left, but a lot of that is just under the streets of modern-day Portsmouth. Places you don't necessarily associate with these earthworks, like Toledo. This is a historic marker, but there's no parking lot, there's nothing. It is a busy road in an industrial district, and you have to park in a neighborhood 2 blocks away if you want to go take a picture of this little stone that was set by the Daughters of the American Revolution that shows an illustration of a banked up fort on the Maumee River. One trend that you see that starts to get into the question of how people used these mounds after the valley was colonized is Pittsburgh, which of course was one of the earliest settlements in the Ohio Valley, right at the start of the river. The French garrison at Fort Duquesne was the first European presence at what is now Pittsburgh. It was a little wooden fortification of soldiers. They had a cemetery. First burial was 1754. And they put that cemetery, you can't really see it in the picture, but it would have been up, around here, outside the fort itself, and they called it St. Mary's Mount, and that's where they put their cemetery. There was a mount there. That is the first recorded instance we have of a European or American settlement or cemetery being sited concurrent with an Indian mound. Today, you can visit Trinity Church in Pittsburgh. The mound is no longer there, but part of the cemetery is, and there's a marker that tells that story. After the French were forced out of Fort Duquesne, the British garrison at Fort Pitt continued to use that cemetery, and it became the pioneer cemetery of the city of Pittsburgh. This trend continues as people settle further on down the valley. Tiltonsville is one of the earliest examples. That is up towards Steubenville, right on the Ohio River, an old mound cemetery there. A lot of people have seen the Mound Cemetery in Marietta. That's probably the most famous of this phenomenon, but in kind of a little suburban neighborhood of Marietta called Devola, there's an older one. The Devola Cemetery was platted around a mound in 1799. Marietta is the famous one, and it's a really interesting case. This is the one place where you have documented evidence where the people who located this cemetery there said that they were doing so specifically with the goal of preserving the mound. The founders of Marietta were highly educated men. They were concerned with studies of antiquity, and they tried several different methods to save major components of the Marietta earthworks from being destroyed by farming or destroyed by construction of houses, streets, businesses. And one way to do it is to plat your cemetery where there is a mound. This is a time period before we have a sense of historic preservation as we understand it today. There's no concept of setting aside land just for the value of history. You have to come up with a use for that land that is non-destructive, that uses it for an established, accepted purpose, such as a cemetery, but will not result in the mound being plowed under or built on top of, something like that. So from a modern point of view, we see these cemeteries, and there's a lot of them. I have records of 58 of them throughout the Ohio Valley. by our standards, that is something that seems kind of crass and disrespectful. You know, it's the ancient burying ground of somebody else's culture, and we're coming here and citing our stuff on it. But at least in the instance of Marietta, and I do believe in a lot of these instances, this represents a very early manifestation of the preservation impulse of somebody saying, we're going to protect this, and this is the method that we have to do that. You see these all over. There's one in Gallipolis, where they actually tore down most of the mound to put that gazebo on it. This is Piketon, Muskingum County, Jackson County. Now, a lot of times you find these mound cemeteries in the earliest cemeteries in a community. A lot of times you find them in association with Revolutionary war graves or 1812 war graves. This is Jackson County, and you can see a row of Revolutionary War veterans right in front of the mound, and the two graves right on top of the mound are one of them is a Revolutionary War vet, and the rest are his family. They're the founders of that community. So these mound cemeteries, often the mound itself, if there are modern burials in it, those are often a place of honor. Again, disrespectful by the standards of today, but this shows you that people are viewing these sites as something special, something of, a place of reverence. And technology issues, there we go. This is just a really pretty one in Meigs County, and it is a beautiful example because this field is still being plowed, but that little cemetery with this pretty little cut sandstone wall that protects it, serves as a buffer zone, is in perfect condition, relatively speaking. That mound would not be there if somebody had not put that cemetery there. It would have been plowed under, and it was already small to start with. You wouldn't have anything to look at. And then this phenomenon is still going on. The most recent grave that I'm aware of in a Native American mound is near Charleston, West Virginia, 2014. Somebody was buried in, I believe it's called the Creel Mound. Creel Mound. Actually, no, that's up in, it's not the same mound. I know the Creel Mound, but
it's in South Charleston too.
This is a second one, and I got those two confused. But yeah, that's less than 10 years ago, somebody was buried in one of these mounds. A little one in Zaleski. And then this chart just shows you when this phenomenon peaks. We're talking the first couple decades of the 1800s is when you see a lot of these mound cemeteries established. So that is what historic preservation looks like at that point. It's somebody coming up with a land use that will prevent the mound from being destroyed, that will keep it as a monument to posterity. That doesn't necessarily mean people are respecting, the Native American builders. People had all of these theories that you know about the lost tribes of Israel and the Vikings and the Celts, but in some sense people are recognizing antiquity, recognizing the importance of that site, and doing something to save it. One little variation on that theme that is a little more overt, the mound being co-opted into our religious tradition, you see them turned into Calvary groupings. This is in Columbus, or just south of Columbus, Lockbourne. In the main Catholic cemetery for the Diocese of Columbus, you have the mound with a very beautiful sculpture on it of the Calvary scene of Jesus on the cross. This is a church camp by Wellston, and I don't know why that picture came out so fuzzy, but a little more of a simplistic Calvary grouping up on the mound. And so that's religious syncretism that all kinds of scholars could have a field day with. The earliest instance of something that resembles what we understand to be a museum comes from Moundsville, West Virginia, the famous Grave Creek Mound, largest Adena mound recorded. In 1838, the property owner dug a tunnel into that mound, arched over a vault on the inside, and charged you a penny admission to go in and see this mysterious ancient wonder. And so it was very commercialized and sensationalized, but this is the first example in American history of the mound being turned into an attraction you would go to in order to experience the history and see something of that. That museum didn't last very long, but that is the first instance we have of that kind of a phenomenon. And then I just want to go through kind of a gamut of different uses of these earthworks, how they were reincorporated into our landscape. The Ohio Canal is famous. That was the first great economic developer of our state. and the Licking Summit Reservoir for that canal, today it's Buckeye Lake, was created by taking a bunch of stone from a very large mound and turning it into a dam to dam off a fork of the Licking River. That was the water that flowed down through the canal to Chillicothe. There's some folks that will tell you this mound never existed. It does. I've seen the base of it. It's on the I-70 right-of-way today, and if you really want to hack through the brush, there's still in places 5 feet of the base of this stone mound still sitting there. All kinds of institutions were influenced by this. These are the Sacravia walls in Marietta. It was a graded way from the Muskingum River up to the plain where the main body of this Hopewell complex sat, with 2 high earthen walls. That was part of the property that the Marietta founders set aside to try and preserve for future generations. And they succeeded for 50 years. They kept this from development until some, petty little instance of corruption in the city council. Somebody on city council had a brickmaking business and was allowed to tear those walls down. It was very fine clay. And this might be a little bit of an apocryphal story, but supposedly the clay from those walls was turned into bricks to build the Unitarian church that still stands in Marietta. That church is, for all intents and purposes, made of the material that used to be, Hopewell Earthworks. I mentioned the one in Circleville. There was that mound that I pointed out on the diagram. You can see St. Philip's Church. It's a newer building, but it sits on the site of an older church. You can see the rise that it sits on. That's the base of what they called Mount Gilboa Mound. I ripped that picture off the internet. I apologize if this guy is in the audience for us today, but he's pointing out where that was on that diagram. This phenomenon went on for a long time. Another part of the Marietta Earthworks was Capitolium Mound, and that was a city-owned lot. And when Carnegie endowed all his famous libraries, the people in charge of Marietta decided that city-owned lot would be a prime spot to put their library. So the mound is still there. It really wasn't changed in any serious material way. They just plunked the library right down on top of what was already a flat platform mound. Much later on, more recently, they installed an elevator shaft in that library to have it ADA accessible, and that involved an excavation and the addition of a basement space. And it's now the only place that I know of where you can use the restroom on the inside of an Indian mound. Schools are no different. These are both in the plains, in my home territory. The Old Plains High School was built right over a quote, sacred circle earthwork. This building was originally a schoolhouse, and this photo is not actually great. The back view is better, but it sits up on what is a discernible rise, the base of a mound that is, in part at least, still there. And that's still going on. This is Little Miami High School, out not too far from Cincinnati. It sits on remnants of the Stubbs Earthworks, and there were a lot more remnants until 1998 when that high school went up. Our state capitol is a very similar instance to the Unitarian Church in Marietta. If you've been to downtown Columbus, you have seen Mound Street. That was named for a large Indian mound that sat at the intersection of Mound Street and High Street. The streets kind of went around the mound. Somebody had a house on top of it. Until 1839, the state government was putting up their second state house, and they decided to pull that mound down to get clay for bricks. That state house burnt down, but they reused the bricks in 1861 when they put up our present state house. And there is a little historic marker on the parking garage for the state house that commemorates that. Industry often destroyed mounds. This picture is down in Meigs County, not too far from Racine, and right across the road from where I'm standing to take this photo is a strip mine, a coal mine. The gentleman who owns this property has for many years, is the story that I heard it, fended off very generous offers from the coal mine for this property. If they ever got their hands on the property, that mound would be gone. So this is an instance of an individual, with no financial interest to preserve the mound, doing so because he believes that it's an ancient monument and that's important. sort of a very different story in the same vein is in Columbus. Again, not a great picture, it's kind of zoomed in, but this is a limestone quarry. Marble Cliff area of Columbus was famous for its limestone. They're still quarrying there. One of their old quarry pits, though, it's worked out and it's a lake now. The quarry company quarried all around this little island and saved the mound by doing it. I've never seen any record indicating that was deliberate, but why on earth else would they leave this one little island with that mound? There's an Ohio historical... Yes, sir?
You might inquire at ODNR and their division of mining.
Oh, okay.
Or something.
That's a good idea.
There may have been a permit requirement to do the mining.
Okay.
So you might run that, just ask.
That's a very good idea, yeah. It's the city owns it now. They use it as
Right.
a settling pond for their water treatment plant. And if you are familiar with the Shrum Mound in Columbus, it's an Ohio History Connection site, a pretty good size Adena mound. From that site, you can see this mound in that quarry. Some fun little ways that mounds were incorporated into early European settler communities. In Zanesville, there is record of the town whipping post being set up on an Indian mound on the present site of their courthouse lot. And then back in Moundsville, West Virginia, when the state of West Virginia finally stepped in to purchase the Grave Creek Mound, the largest Adena mound, which was threatened with destruction at that time, they didn't have a mechanism for the state preserving history for its own sake. They needed a state institution to become a caretaker of that mound. The only state institution present in Moundsville was the prison. So they put it under the supervision of the prison warden, and for many years, that was the upkeep on that mound. And it was a tourist attraction by that point. People would come to see it. The prison set up a little museum and staffed it with prisoners, but that is part of the story of that mound's preservation. Of course, right here in Chillicothe, we're moving into a semi-formal ethic of preservation. Mound City survived for a while because it was part of a farmer's woodlot. And that is a deliberate decision. This, wonderful level glacial plain is all prime farmland. But you see in the Squire and Davis illustration, this square of trees is left right around the earthworks that are right out there. And that ensured their preservation for much longer than a lot of the Hopewell Earthworks kept, stuck around. Later on, Camp Sherman, the U.S. government bought the property, did a lot of damage, but also ultimately led to the establishment of the national park. And so these mounds are starting to be more in the public consciousness. People enjoy going to see them. They're not necessarily purely historic attractions yet, but they're part of the attraction. Up in Newark, the Licking County Fair was set up at what is today the Great Circle Earthworks. The State Fair was actually held there for several years. And so it very much was part of the draw to go to the fair and see the mysterious ancient works, but not enough of a draw on its own to be set up as a historic attraction in its own right. And you start seeing these parks pop up everywhere. After the fair moved out, a private amusement park, one of the early trolley parks, as they're called, was set up on the same site. It's called Idlewild Park. Survived until the Great Depression. And you see this phenomenon quite a fair bit too. Over in Indiana, today it's called Mound State Park, but it was one of these trolley parks. The trolley lines would, build from the town out into the suburbs, and they realized people weren't buying trolley tickets on a Sunday because they didn't have to go to work, so the trolley lines set up amusement parks at the end of their tracks to give people an excuse to buy a trolley ticket on a Sunday. And if you happen to have an Indian mound nearby, that was an added little attraction. So this is a very grainy photo, but I love it because it shows one of the attractions was this little miniature train ride going right around the perimeter of the mound there. A place you can still go see this phenomenon is Huntington, West Virginia. Camden Park is one of the last survivors of these traditional trolley parks, and that park is built right around an Indian mound. Still on the grounds. You can go see it today. We all know about the famous golf club controversy going on up in Newark, which was recently adjudicated, but I believe they're still playing golf there, at least for the present time. But that's not uncommon either. Newark is the very famous one. The Ohio Historical Society acquired control over this property. They needed somebody to look after the grounds and still to use it for something other than pure preservation. So they leased it to a golf club, which for 1910, that was all somebody knew how to do, is how to find a use for this land that will not destroy the mounds, but will give it some other purpose. But you see this all over the place. The Columbus Country Club has a beautiful little ring ditch and central conical mound in very good shape, except that one of the walls has been encroached on by a putting green. I was thrown out of that golf club shortly after taking that picture. Yet another phenomenon that you see is historic homes. Very often people wanted to associate their new place in the new world with a sense of antiquity. And so they will put their farmhouse right down amongst the mounds. That means that if it's in your dooryard of your farm, you're not plowing it and the mounds are going to be saved. So over in Bainbridge, the old, is it Seip or Seip?
We say Seip.
Seip, their house sits right on the wall. And those are the best preserved portion of the original wall of that earthworks, is where the house sat, because that's where you're not plowing. Down in West Virginia, Henderson Hall, beautiful historic home in Williamstown, West Virginia, right across the river from Marietta. I got this photo late one night, so it's not a great photo either. But this old historic home, the oldest part of it is 1830s. It sits smack in the middle of a group of 3 Adena mounds. And those mounds are in very good shape because they were not in the plowed field. A choice had been made to situate that farmhouse right there, and that's what saved the mounds. Often they were used as war memorials, which is kind of an allied purpose to how I describe, you'll see the Revolutionary graves and the mound cemeteries. Here is two Civil War memorials on the Union side and on the Confederate side in Newark and in Romney, West Virginia. The people down in Romney, West Virginia like to say that this is the first Confederate memorial in the country, and that happens to be based around an Indian mound. Buffington Island, Meigs County, Ohio, the only important Civil War battle fought in the state of Ohio. Now that's a pretty big battlefield, all across what is called Portland Bottom. But the portion of it that the state chose to acquire as their memorial to that battle was the portion that had a lovely medium-sized Adena mound on it. And you see, other types of memorialization. Over in Dayton, there's a group of mounds that has been designated as a Wright Brothers memorial. Somebody who had nothing to do with ancient heritage. They're pioneers in aviation, but we see these mounds as something important, something rare and cool and worth associating with other things that we find to be rare and cool and important. And now we start getting into formal preservation. The first state parks in Ohio were both earthwork sites. So Serpent Mound is a transition. It was initially preserved when some concerned citizens of Boston heard that it was in danger of destruction, raised some money among the wealthy ladies of New England, bought the property, and transferred it to the Peabody Museum, which is that Yale or Harvard? Does anybody know? Harvard? That would make sense. We're keeping it in Massachusetts. The Peabody Museum held the property for 14 years until they turned it back over to the state of Ohio, because by that point, Ohio was in the business of preserving earthworks. In 1891, 9 years prior to Serpent Mound being transferred to the state, we had established our first state park at Fort Ancient in Warren County, specifically for the purpose, and no other purpose, of saving the earthworks there. So 1891, this finally happens. We've come to the point in our society where we realize these places are worth saving for their own value, for their own sake, and you don't necessarily need any other reason to save them. And so now I just want to go through the various types of organizations and entities which preserve earthworks today. A lot of them are held by cities and towns. I have 36 sites that are preserved just by, in a city park, something like that. You have Portsmouth, Ohio, Ashland, Kentucky, both have really important earthworks that are saved as part of a city park. The federal government starts to get involved in the Depression era because the CCC is doing, development projects just for the sake of keeping people employed, but and bettering parks, community facilities all across the country. You see a lot of CCC involvement at these sites. Over in far southern Fairfield County, you have the Tarleton Cross Mound. That park was developed and made publicly accessible when the CCC came in and put a really nice little bridge across the creek that allows people to hike up to that mound. They did a lot of work at Fort Ancient. They did a lot of work at a lot of different sites. Of course, the main federal involvement today is right here at Hopewell Culture. Mound City was the first unit of that as far back as 1923, 100 years ago. And now, as you know, there's six units at Mound City, and that is, the only national park that is preserving Ohio earthworks, obviously, although there are some in Cuyahoga Valley. That's not the focus of that park. Private groups play their role. The Archaeological Conservancy is a very important group. They hold a lot of sites themselves. I have 26 mound sites that they preserve themselves in the Ohio Valley. They actually got their start way out west, preserving, Pueblo ruins and stuff like that. But their first important purchase in the east was the Hopewell group itself. It was under threat of demolition. Archaeological Conservancy stepped in, bought that property, and held it while the wheels of government turned, until such time as it was able to be integrated into the national park. A lot of these mounds, though, are not preserved by organizations who have the dedicated purpose of preserving mounds and earthworks. They're incidentally preserved on other conserved land. So our state forests have, I have a record of 28, there's probably a lot more than that. Other, local groups that conserve land, in my hometown, our local conservancy group has several mounds throughout their properties. And they don't buy those properties for the sake of preserving mounds, but it just so happens that that's a happy little side effect. Our metro park systems, all of our major cities have their own dedicated park systems, and all of those major cities' park systems happen to hold earthworks within their preserves. So this is not a good photo of the mound itself, but it shows, at least some signage in Cincinnati. The Columbus metro parks really have a lot of them, and often they're very well signed and interpreted. But Cleveland, too. You don't associate Cleveland with these earthworks as much, but if you go to Rocky Fork Reservation in Cleveland, you can see what's called a Whittlesey Fort. And smaller park districts are involved, too. Tarleton Cross used to be an Ohio History Connection property. They have farmed out a lot of their historic sites, and it's now controlled by Fairfield County Parks District, just a local district. Local historical societies play an important role as well. One of the most important effigy mounds in the United States is held by, little old Licking County Historical Society up in Granville. That's the so-called Alligator Mound. But Athens County Historical Society, Williams County Historical Society, I have 8 or 9 of these sites that are controlled by local historic societies. Another private actors, the Heartland Earthworks Conservancy, they don't, as far as I'm aware, own any of these sites, but they do a lot of work in working with private landowners to conserve and interpret and preserve these sites. And so the mall, on one of the many malls on Bridge Street here in Chillicothe, has this totally incongruous little mound sitting in their parking lot. This is really reconstructed. It had been plowed under for many years. I believe this chapter was probably involved in the work that was done there. But this is one of my favorite sites in Ohio because as funny as it looks sitting in the parking lot of that mall, it's a perfect example of how, if you have a mind to, you can preserve a historic site and still, have your mall there, and it's still part of the landscape. Arc of Appalachia preserves some very important sites in Ohio. They are an organization who got started with biological, ecological conservation. That still is their main mission. They hold a total of 8 earthwork sites, and even though their main mission is an ecological one, they have some of the most important sites that are kind of overlooked by other organizations in Ohio. Their most recent really important acquisition was the Tremper Mound. They brought together several disparate properties. It was a pretty impressive thing, and this one is sort of already unofficially open to the public, but they're expecting a grand opening pretty soon. The unhappy side of things, though, is that the destruction of mounds is still very much ongoing. A lot of people think that their simplistic version of the story is we came in, we farmed most of these mounds out of existence 200 years ago, and the few that we have left are shiny little museum pieces that are safe forever, but that's not true. There's the best estimate I've seen for how many earthworks were in Ohio at the time of contact is around about 11,000, and probably half of them are still there, but most of them are not formally preserved in any sense, and a lot of them every year we're losing more of them. This was an elementary school down in Ripley on the Ohio River, opened in 2003, and that mound was in a city park. But the powers that be decided that they needed a new school, and it was more important to transfer that city park land to the school district, mound or not, and build a new elementary school there. So that's a relatively recent loss. This is up in the plains. That is a mound that is cut clean in half with a bulldozer. Somebody came in and logged the hillside that it sits on, and they brought that bulldozer down the ridge, and the mound was in their way, and now half of it's not there anymore. Supposedly there's an industrial park down near Tucker's Plains in Meigs County that we're looking at a couple mounds likely to be bulldozed in the upcoming days in Meigs. In some cases where these earthworks have been lost, though, we have features in the landscape. I love historic markers. Historic markers are how we try and correct the record even a little bit. It is, history, but it's out there in the landscape for the public to see. A lot of earthworks and other ancient sites were destroyed when the modern dams were built on the Ohio River, raised the water level so that barges can run on it. And so this is in New Martinsville, West Virginia. You can see a little historic marker that commemorates that. This one's put there by the state. This is up in Columbus, and it's a local historical society in Clintonville. This is a very sad story. It was a well-preserved circular mound, and the developers who were putting a subdivision on that land wanted to make it the centerpiece of the park that was going to be in their subdivision, until some of the people who had already bought lots that were going to be developed, said, no, we don't want that kind of bad juju. We want that thing gone. That was a great loss up in Columbus, but there's a historical marker that tells that story today, and it still has its presence in the landscape. The mounds have also been put to advertising purposes. You've probably seen this U-Haul driving around with the Serpent Mound on it, but that's not a new phenomenon either. This is the big Hartman Mound, which is the biggest one left in the plains today, and you can see a Pepsi billboard sitting on the top of it, about 1930. And then so now I'm talking about the ways that people interact with these earthworks today, the way they influence people's lives, the way people think about them. And so this is a photo from right in this building, the beautiful stained glass pieces that were made of all of the units of the Hopewell Culture Park. This is some artwork that a Columbus artist did. I think she did these pieces in the 80s. She took dirt from various earthwork sites and incorporated them into handmade paper. And I saw those on display in the Art Museum in Columbus. Of course, they're big community boosters in a lot of the places. Obviously, Peebles, a lot of their economy is people visiting Serpent Mound. This mural is up in Peebles. I thought this one's interesting because it's in Clintonville, but it is the Serpent Mound, just an underpass in Columbus. It's public art where people are thinking about the ancient culture that was here. It's still part of people's lives. This is, I don't know if it's still on display in Newark, but this was up in the Works Museum in Newark in January. And this is actually an indigenous artist who is making art that draws upon the mounds as a visual inspiration, as an element of design. Sometimes the ways that these things find their place in people's modern imagination can be really very funny. This is a very well-preserved mound up in Worthington, and this is right next door. Somebody has built this wonderful, excellent house that quite obviously incorporates, the visual cues of the mound into its design. You've heard of, Greek revival, Egyptian revival. This is Hopewellian revival. And these, revivalist iterations of the earthworks are a really interesting phenomenon. University of Cincinnati recently did a very big publicized redevelopment of its campus and put this on it. It's and the architect, the landscape architect who did this, expressly quoted, referenced the Indigenous Earthworks of Ohio as part of the reason that he put this here. This is up in Dublin, and it's the same story. An artist built this circle mound and a little copper astronomical observatory house, and he said that was based on, trying to draw on that visual tradition of the earthworks of Ohio. Another way people have recreated mounds is by physically moving them. Fairmont, West Virginia, in the Monongahela Valley, their state teacher training college, their normal school, was put up in 1893, and the centerpiece of campus was this little mound. They chopped the top off it, but it was the mascot of campus. Their yearbook was called the Mound. All of the class pictures are gathered around it. Well, in 1929, they moved the campus a little bit out of town. And when they did that, they put that dirt in a dump truck and put it there. And physically moved the Fairmont Mound. But now they've sort of faded from the school lore. I was down there talking to their historian, and she actually didn't know that story. That little mulched over lump of dirt. But I was able to find the photograph of them dedicating it in 1929 when they moved that dirt. This is another interesting instance of a sort of recreated mound down in Portsmouth. There's a mound down there, the Infirmary Mound. In the 80s, there was an excavation there. They discovered grave sites, and I believe it was a Cherokee man sort of coordinated the reinterment of those grave sites in these 3 little stone mounds, and they named it the Kalani Mound, and that is supposed to be the reinterment of the people who originally made the infirmary mound there. Up in Dublin, there's a cool project going on now. There is one of these earthworks that survives because of a historic house. This is the original earthwork, the little house that had the mound in its dooryard, kept it from being plowed down. It's not in nearly as good a condition as this illustration suggests, so the city of Dublin, they turned this property into a park, and they are going to build their own brand new mound to put it in sort of mint condition, show people what it would have looked like, rather than restore the original, as was done at Mound City. That represents an evolution of that practice. People want to leave the original mound in its, visible but not pristine state, and put a new one nearby to show what that pristine state would have looked like. And then the last little one I want to leave with is, these mounds are still not just in our consciousness in a historical and factual way, but a lot of the people who are interested, for better or worse, in these earthworks stray into much more fantastical territory. This is, crop circles that are supposed to be part of the lore that surrounds these mounds. This is taken in the rock shop up in Peebles, if you know that place. And they're just plain landscapes of celebration in some cases. This is a picture I took on the Alligator Mound in Granville. Somebody had been setting off fireworks on it. It's still this prominence on the hill, a high point, the same landscape that quite possibly inspired the builders of the mound is the kind of landscape that we today want to head to when we're celebrating something. So that's the presentation I have for you. Does anybody have any questions about anything? Yes, sir?
The mound that was moved from, was it the campus?
Yeah, in Fairmont.
Was it a sacred mound where there may have been remains there?
Yes, certainly. It's probably an Adena burial mound.
So they moved the remains as well, or?
Whatever remains there may still have been. They had already cut a lot of the mound off when they established the school, but yes, it all would have been jumbled up.
Alex, I really, really love the way you have highlighted all these different perspectives that you have as a geographer into this mountain landscape. I must ask you, how long did it take you to drive around and collect all of it?
Well, it's a hobby.
Give us a guesstimate.
All the pictures you've taken have been, all the pictures you've seen I've taken in the past 2 years. That's the time period we're talking about.
Great job.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Alex, you mentioned that that there are no historic markers in Cincinnati for mounds, but that's not exactly true.
Oh, that's not true? They do have some?
If you go down along Mound Street, right in downtown, there's one built right into the side of one of the bank buildings down there.
Okay.
Where one of the mounds used to be.
Okay, thank you. That's the kind of info I'm looking for. I've looked a little bit around Cincinnati, not been able to see some or find any reference
Also,
online.
along the waterfront, there's a structure that has been built into the park along the waterfront, which the architects designed to make a Serpent Mound.
Okay.
And so that's another sort of modern day structure that's inspired by Serpent Mound.
Okay, that stuff's just fascinating. The way people put it back into the landscape, put their own interpretation on it, always their own spin on it.
If there's other little plaques like in Clintonville, would you be interested in a photo? Could
Certainly,
email you or
certainly.
something? Yeah, right at Cook Road in Indianola, there's a real nice marker.
Cook and Indianola, I'm gonna write that down.
Yeah, and as a matter of fact, we need a speaker at our
Yes.
August meeting of Six Rivers Chapter, and we'd love to have you.
I would be happy to. Well, I guess actually, the one thing I forgot to say is, I do this because I like it, but part of the reason I agreed to do this today is I'm involved with a group over in the Plains. We are just in the beginning phases of founding a nonprofit. It's called the Friends of the Plains Mounds, and our objectives are, education and interpretation, and if we really get enough interest, hopefully promoting the preservation of what's left of the Plains complex. So I wish we had a website or something I could point you to. Whenever we do, I'll send the link to Gary and kindly ask him if he'll disseminate it among the membership here.
We'll put it on our Facebook.
Oh, that'd be
and Cedar
wonderful.
Chapter page.
But that's what I'm trying to do, running around giving these talks, is promote Friends of the Plains Mounds.
One of the people that comes to our Six Rivers meeting is Al Torino, that's good friends with Jared Burks.
Oh, yeah,
Does all that.
yeah, Altonetti.
But those people have a wealth of insight on all this as far as the historic preservation
Yes.
office goes, and can give you some background.
Tonetti's been giving me some help with the nonprofit
Okay.
charter and all of that.
Okay, yeah,
He's
but
been
they'd be a
very
good
helpful.
resource.
Yeah.
I have a question. You had a chart there showing people being buried in the mounds, and it kind of topped out about 1840 or so, which
Yes.
would be the settlers coming in here, like the first generation.
That's true. I mean, a lot of these pioneers, that does just represent the time
Yeah.
period when people were settling.
If I went further west, let's say if I went to Michigan or
Mm-hmm.
Minnesota, I wonder what that would look like.
I do wonder, this chart incorporates Ohio, West Virginia, Indiana, and eastern Kentucky.
Okay.
Those are the data points that I have. But yeah, you find these mound cemeteries in a lot of states, as far out as, I think I've heard of one in North Dakota. So I'd be very curious to do that kind of analysis, see if it just follows the frontier or what.
You
Yeah.
may have covered this earlier, I wasn't here, but do these mounds have any other purpose other than for burial? Or they have any other function other than just for burial?
Sure, I mean, I think we could never understand all the functions, but I think you could probably talk a little bit about the function of the Hopewell Works. Some of them were ceremonial rather than burial. They had all these cool astronomical alignments built into the architecture of them, and the Serpent Mound, is not a burial mound. It is an effigy mound. It depicts a serpent. Nobody knows exactly why these cultural groups would have chosen to depict a serpent, but they had their cultural reasons for doing so.
Alligator's another one.
Yeah. And the alligator mound, the best interpretation I've heard is that it likely represents a possum. We didn't have alligators in North America. But they had some of them. Oh yes.
Yeah, in Circleville, Mount Giabola,
Yes.
there's some of the photos show it even higher, where they had the old church.
Yeah.
They invited me to come in to see the basement, and that was probably one of the most interesting little, it showed part of the glacier wall, but there was a dome in the very bottom that they built over, they didn't know what, but in the wall there was a hole and there was a chamber underneath.
Oh.
But they,
They
some
don't know
of the
what-
bodies they had found, I don't know what happened to them.
Right,
A lot of them, they just ran them right on down towards the museum.
right.
But perpendicular to that mound, and it shows it on the one large map of the ancient earthworks, there was another mound of the same height.
Oh,
on
okay.
Vargas Creek.
Mhm.
And when they flattened it, Pickaway Street, we can see all of that.
Mhm. And Circleville is a really fascinating case. I mean, they say it's the first example of urban redevelopment in America. They
It's sad.
originally platted the town
Yeah.
around the circle, and so they did level the walls, but it preserved part of that design in the landscape. But starting in the 1830s, they came through and said that circle is dreadfully inconvenient. We want to have a grid like any other town would, and they erased all trace of what those earthworks were.
Appalachian and Pickaway County have actually wanted to do green spots.
Yeah, yeah.
But what they've done, all the last 3 ones that they bought have mounds on them.
That's cool.
So now they're including the mounds when they're doing their green spots.
That's really cool. Well, we're in a kind of a historical moment of awakening appreciation. We've got the UNESCO effort that's just around the corner, that kind of designation, and people all over the world are hearing about the.
You didn't even
earthworks that we
include
have
state
here.
den.
What's that, sir?
You didn't include state den.
Oh, right, yes, I've heard about that too. Yeah,
I mean, you missed a whole bunch.
sure, I could never put.
Well, how many did he say? Like you said, 11,000, there's no way in the timeframe you could cover, even
Right.
if there was half that amount.
I wish I could.
Yeah.
Have you ever used Z-maps for the,
No.
mounds and stuff?
No.
I was looking through Gallia counties, there's a bunch there that just completely been wiped out.
Yeah.
Like there's one along Chickamauga Creek right next to Mound Cemetery they built the, junior high and the gym and the parking lot right on top of it.
Yeah,
And then there was supposedly a mound in Central Park in Gallipolis that
I've heard that too, right where the gazebo sits.
no result of that whatsoever. And then on down towards Crown City, I've known of at least 3 that's been dug in from Crown City to Gallipolis.
On the way to the
Yeah.
cemetery. Isn't there a mound in the
Also, with all the different mounds, the prior speakers that we've had have done some really good job also in tying and disseminating information on the men that were investigating during the
Yeah.
1800s.
Yeah.
And how most of those artifacts went up to Chicago to the World's Fair
Mhm.
and then ended up going to Europe and everywhere
Yeah.
else. And then, of course, when they had the fire in Chicago, a lot of those were lost.
All of Squire and Davis's collection is still in the British Museum, over in London. Yeah. Oh, really?
What was that? I didn't hear what you said.
Not all of Squire Davis's artifacts are at the British Museum. There's a selection that Davis donated to the Royal Museum in Copenhagen.
Oh,
Denmark.
Denmark.
Oh, wow.
And around 1908, the Royal Museum of Denmark donated a portion of those artifacts to another museum called the Odense Museum in Denmark.
Huh.
And Squire had retained several effigy pipes which were purchased at auction in 1874 by the American Museum of Natural History
In Washington?
in New York.
Oh,
actually,
okay.
Which I think now is part of the Smithsonian collection.
Wow.
Yeah, it's all part of, when I was visiting the Queen's Castle there in Austria, there was some artifacts that it said from the mounds here in America. And they, of course, if you go over there and visit, it's really an elaborate. She had rooms built for different provinces or different areas around the world, Africa, and there was one room dedicated to
Isn't that something?
some of the artifacts from here in North America, and a lot of them were from the Ohio Valley region.
Sure, I'm sure.
So if you ever get a chance,
Go to
you're
Austria.
in Austria, that is really quite, her castle is quite, the King's Castle and then the Queen's Castle is across from it, and it's very elaborate and huge.
It's interesting that so much of the appreciation you see of our sites comes from Europe. I mean, just anecdotally, I've heard that, the Germans are super interested in the World Heritage designation. If you go to Europe, I mean, I've spent some time in Britain. You can go to any large bookstore and buy a map, and it's, you know, the equivalent of like a USGS quadrangle, but it has every single ancient site, every barrow, you know, every mound burial, every stone circle ring, marked out in great detail. And that's a very, very different culture from what we have in the United States. We tend to, for one thing, there's more access to private land in Great Britain than in a lot of Europe. But here we have such a tremendous problem with people desecrating and looting that most of that information is very much kept on a restricted need-to-know basis, even where it is in the databases of whatever relevant government institutions hold it. I mean,
Well, part of that has to do with the laws over in England particularly, that all those ancient sites are designated as part of the trust of the country. You know, it would be as if the state of Ohio would need to pass a law to designate that all ancient sites are part of the trust of the government.
Sure, and the fact is we haven't done anything like that. It's a very different culture around these sites and how the public interacts with them and sees them and to appreciate.
Having family in Germany, their taxes actually go to the preservation of artifacts, and they deem churches as well as part of that historical and artifact. So when your taxes are paid, that is for the preservation of all those different buildings and whatnot. And it's quite spectacular, some of those
Yeah, it is.
displays and
It is.
structures.
And you mentioned a couple of, you know, current ongoing examples of mounds and earthworks being destroyed as we speak. And there is, to date, there's nothing illegal about
No,
that.
certainly Ohio has some of the weakest laws in the nation around that.
weakest in the nation.
There was something in the news in France. There was an ancient stone circle that got destroyed. They were building some kind of a mall. And the fact is, that happens every day here. In France, that's such an uncommon occurrence that it made the news in the United States. Whereas we don't bat an eye when it's happening right in our backyards.
Yeah, in alignment with what you're saying there, I saw last week, I believe it was, a young man and his girlfriend, or maybe his intended, were at the Coliseum, and he was carving
Oh, I
with
saw that,
his key
yeah.
their initials, and he was arrested and faced up to 5 years in prison. 5 years.
Well, one of the things too I'm involved with is the identification, which I have been in the past, identification of Native American marker trees.
Oh, yeah.
And I've actually, we have a friend of ours, a Peepers, we had located one on their property, which is up north of Licking County, and actually had that designated as a marker trail tree. And it's kind of unique when you look at those marker trees and you take, like you said, a bearing on the directions that they're pointing. A lot of those are pointing to water or pointing to
One of these mounds?
one of these mounds.
Yep.
So it's very intuitive how all this is tied together, of the historical aspects of these.
It is. Once you start looking into it. Yeah. There's so much more of a niche interest in the United States than ancient history is in a lot of countries. We're a new country. We don't have the same sense of historic consciousness that, you know, we keep talking about people over in Europe have with their heritage. Except for people like us who do appreciate the history and have that kind of historic consciousness. Good for us.
Well, folks,
Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Enjoy.